Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. The more time I've spent outdoors, the more I've learned about the threats our trees face here in Pennsylvania. It seems like every other day I'm finding out about a new disease or an invasive plant or an insect that's come to our shores and is devastating our trees. It's sad to see our forests choked by kudzu vines, to see our trees impacted by the emerald ash borer, spongy moth, and hemlock woolly adelgid, to see the once mighty American chestnut tree wiped out by blight. And let's not forget about other issues like overforesting, wildfires, and climate change, all taking a bite from our forests, one tree at a time. We will never have the forest that our ancestors would have seen. Old-growth trees are limited to a few areas in the Commonwealth, and development has sliced most of our forests into bite-sized pieces. But that doesn't mean we just give up. No way. A dedicated group of scientists and foresters are working to address these issues, protect our forests, and stay ahead of the future threats that may try to take even more trees from our landscape. They're testing out new methods and processes that could save the trees that we have, and hopefully, prevent more species from being taken from us. But it's not easy work. They're constantly having to adapt to new threats present in an ever-connected world. It's incredibly important work. Anyone who cares for the outdoors, whether you're a hunter or a hiker, needs to know about what each of us can do to address these threats on our property and help these scientists protect our forests. I'm excited to welcome Rosa Yu to the podcast. Rosa is a forest health manager with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Rosa, thanks so much for joining the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a fan of the podcast, so I'm excited to have been invited.
When we talk about threats to trees in Pennsylvania, what rises to the top of your list right now and why?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question, and I might give you an answer that is not an answer, but it is essentially, to me, two things. It's really anything that affects a forest or tree's ability to regenerate. So that's very broad, but that is a serious concern. So anything that um, you can think about invasive plants, like if you have mature trees, but in the understory it's invasive plants and those trees are not able to successfully regenerate, that could be a serious forest health threat. And then we also think about things like insects or diseases that prematurely cause mortality to mature trees where they, can't produce seed and regenerate another. So those types of things are major when it impacts a tree's ability to regenerate. There's also abiotic issues. So things like drought or early frost, they cause extra stress on the trees and they may not dedicate the energy they need to produce seeds and things like that, or eventually decline and mortality, right? So that is like a major concern dealing with forests health. And the second thing are things that we don't know. So, we hope that we have a good handle of what's here today, but what we don't know is what will show up tomorrow. And when those like surprises show up and we can't address it quickly, um, that of course, is a window of time where we could potentially have like widespread mortality or something could spread because we don't quite understand the biology behind it. One good example is beech leaf disease. That was really a mystery for a long time. People in Ohio were, saw symptoms on trees. They were observing decline and they were running a lot of tests. They couldn't identify what was happening to these trees, what was causing it. And so for about 7 years, nobody knew. Nobody knew what it was, how it was spreading. And so it kind of was moving along on its own until it was finally associated with a nematode. But there's still so many unanswered questions even today. So it's really hard to address like things that are the unknown, things that we don't know.
I mean, that's difficult right there where you say all the problems that we do and then all the problems that we don't don't know. I
Yes.
mean, the fact that we have any trees seems almost like a miracle with so many things that they're going through.
Yeah, I will say that there are across the world uh, projects where they plant sentinel trees. So let's say we know a lot of pests that can establish in the US are from Europe or Asia. And so we have plots in those areas of our native trees, and studies are ongoing of what native organisms there impact those trees. So to some extent, we're trying to be a little bit proactive to know, like, hey, there's a pest that really, like one of them is a pest that really goes after sweet gum. It has not been found in North America, but in Asia, when they planted sweet gum trees, they get attacked by an insect. So pretty severe. So that's one thing that, should it be found in North America, at least we kind of have a little bit of an idea beforehand. So things like that are happening, and then vice versa. I could think across all different countries. So that does help us maybe answer a little bit of what we don't know. But the other tricky thing with forest health is that there are things that are like um, that interact with each other. So it might not just be one thing that's affecting the tree health, So that gets really tricky too.
Yeah, you guys have a very easy job, it sounds like.
Yes.
How have invasive insects like the emerald ash borer, spongy moth, and the hemlock woolly adelgid reshaped our forests over the last few decades?
So I think it's still changing because, things that affect forests and trees just take a really long time. But in some places, we can see, like with emerald ash borer, because that affects ash trees and forests so quickly. Trees die within 3 to 4, maybe less years of being infested. Um, and if you think about things like invasive plants or what's in the area when those overstory ash trees die, um, we're certainly not a lot of times getting native plants back. So anytime you think about like that type of canopy impact, and we see it with other species too, spongy moth, hemlock, woolly adelgid, but really with ash, because those are oftentimes found, sometimes along roadways, or a lot of ash trees were planted in communities. So sometimes those impact, can can impact more the what comes in afterwards.
Hmm.
As far as like spongy moth and hemlock woolly adelgid, I mean, it's similar. For hemlock woolly adelgid, I'd say, fortunately for that, it doesn't wipe out like 100% of the hemlocks. There's always some that kind of hang around, and we are finding that it is a little bit more site specific. So hemlock's growing in a little more higher higher quality sites as opposed to like drier ridge tops. They tend to do a little better, but when large patches of hemlock kind of succumb to hemlock woolly adelgid, oftentimes you'll see like the birch or maples kind of take over, that kind of thing. Of course, invasive plants too. But it can cause like a shift in stand composition and what species are there. And of course, if it's not being filled back in with native plants and native species, that's always a huge concern, because then it's like, well, we want to make sure our forests stay as forests and they stay as functionally, native as possible, so that they can serve in that whole web, food web of life and things like that.
How difficult is it to manage invasive insects? I feel like that's a problem that almost seems impossible to try to combat.
Well, yes and no. Most most non or invasive insects can be successfully treated with chemical treatments, right? It's just the scale that we talk about. So obviously you can't, like chemical treatments for emerald ash borer are very successful. You can save an ash tree by treating it with pesticides, and it will be protected from emerald ash borer. But is it realistic to treat a forest of that have ash? No, like we can't do that. It doesn't make sense in a landscape scale. So I think that's what you have to think about, is the scale of it. Um, so what we implement when we can is called integrated pest management, IPM, and that's where you're utilizing different tools. Um, which involves, primarily some level of chemical treatments, maybe a biocontrol, um, maybe some silviculture practices, and maybe some genetic like resistance work. And so by kind of integrating all of those things, you don't rely on just one thing. So we know if you treat an ash tree, it will be protected from emerald ash borer. And maybe in a forested stand, you treat some of the ash trees, but then you are also releasing biological controls. And maybe you are, um, you know, trying to identify which ash are more resilient to emerald ash borer infestation. And so kind of combining all those things, you're doing multiple, like you're trying to tackle the problem from multiple angles. So you're
Hmm.
not focusing on just one thing that might not be feasible. Um, so they do try those tactics, and it seems to work. Hemlock woolly adelgid is another good example of where IPM um, does tend to have pretty good outcomes, but it's just the scale of it, because obviously you can't access or treat every hemlock tree, across the Commonwealth. But certainly integrating those things and looking at resistance, or trees that tend to do better. If like all the neighboring trees are succumbing and dying from hemlock woolly adelgid, and you have a few that look pretty good, like maybe those are the ones you focus on and protect and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Pennsylvania state tree is the eastern hemlock. What does the loss of hemlocks mean beyond just losing a single species?
Yeah. Well, we all know that, you know, everything in nature is connected with everything else, right? So, all the way from like underground, soil to above the ground, talking about things like wildlife or insects, or all the things that rely on the trees. So I hope that we don't lose hemlocks 100%, but there's certainly places that have lost all the hemlocks, because of the adelgid and other related stressors. And, it does impact that forest ecosystem, because obviously the hemlocks serve a very important ecological purpose. And some of the most impactful are the hemlocks that are lost along streams, because hemlocks, historically shaded these streams, and really benefited, wild fish populations. And when the hemlock started to die, it increased the water temperatures. And so, it's kind of like maybe people don't think about the relationship of the loss of hemlocks to fish. But that's a good example of like how they're all kind of interconnected, so it isn't just losing a tree species. It's what's the role of that tree species or forest um, composition on everything else that maybe rely on it.
Yeah, I mean, when you start to think about what happens to wildlife when foundational tree species like oaks and hemlock starts and ash start to disappear, you start looking at all the animals and various flora that interact with those, and it could be extremely impactful.
Sure. Yeah. And certainly those species that rely solely or mostly on these species that are being threatened, will be affected the most. So, what you'll see is that if wildlife or insects can survive on something else, and as that species start to decline, then they'll rely more, and they'll fare a little bit better than something that might rely solely on, hemlock trees or something like that.
How impactful has chestnut blight been on the trees?
So, yeah, it's been very impactful. So, functionally, American chestnut is considered to be extinct. So, functionally extinct, which means that it does not really reproduce well on its own independently. The blight, which is the fungus, affects chestnut trees that reach a certain size. So, and that tree is able to sprout from roots. So, thankfully, thankfully, the chestnut trees are able to do that. So, you can still find sprouts from American chestnuts. Um, And sometimes you do find pretty good sized American chestnut trees also that kind of, um, whether they're resistant to the blight or they are not exposed anymore to the fungus anymore. But yeah, if you look back at the history, American chestnut were a major forest component. Um, and it's not no longer that anymore, right? It's been kind of taken over by other species like oaks. And so it has been pretty impactful.
Can anything be done to address the chestnut blight?
So a lot of work has been done looking at resistance and crossbreeding with the Chinese chestnut, which is resistant to the blight. A lot of work has been going on with that. And then a little more recently, they were looking at a transgenic chestnut, which is they insert a gene that is resistant to the fungus. And then, they would um, outplant those trees to hopefully establish. That work hasn't been fully approved yet for release, but that is some of the work that's been going on, really looking at resistance and resilience to try to bring it back. But nothing has really taken off just yet.
Yeah, it's very strange. I actually found out about, so I'm still relatively new to the outdoors, but I found out about the chestnut blight when I was in Shenandoah National Park, because they kind of have a before and after, like this is what the forest used to look like with all these
Yeah.
chestnut, and they actually have like a couple standing dead chestnut trees, and it just sounds very strange to just know that a species can die off like that. Like
Yeah.
to my new outdoors mind, it's just like, what do you mean trees just grow? Like, what do you mean they could just be wiped out? It's extremely depressing, but also it shows you the importance of having people in your profession and scientists that are working to kind of deal with these problems for the next species that we can hopefully save.
Yeah, and if you've seen some of the historic photographs of American chestnut, it is, yeah, like you're saying, it is pretty impressive of how much it has changed to now, where you likely will not find a large chestnut, and certainly not contiguous stands of them across the landscape. You know.
How do stress trees become more vulnerable to secondary pests and diseases?
Oh, well, this is like one of my favorite questions or topics to talk about because this is really the foundation of forest health, in my opinion. So, I had a professor in college. His name was Paul Mannion, and he developed this thing called a disease decline spiral. And essentially, what it is there's like these three levels in the spiral. So the outer layer is called the predisposing factors. And so essentially, if you're a healthy tree and you have these predisposing factors, you're pretty resilient to them. But if you succumb to any of these predisposing factors, then you move into the next inner layer of the spiral, which then you become susceptible to inciting factors. Maybe I should give some examples. So, predisposing factors are things like age, genetics, soil compaction, climate change. So, if you're a healthy tree, you can kind of be a little resilient. But as you get older or as you get stressed from soil compaction, you move into that next inner spiral, which then puts you at threat of these inciting factors. And what that means is kind of have like less of an immunity. And so now you're becoming more susceptible to things like defoliating insects or drought or frost. And once you succumb to those, then it brings you into the next level in the spiral, which is called contributing factors. And these are things like fungi or bark beetles, viruses, and once you get into that contributing factors and you succumb to those, that is what leads to mortality. So earlier, when I talked about like it might not be one thing that's causing mortality or causing a forest health issue, it is usually a complex of things. And oftentimes, when we get calls or people have questions and they're like, "My tree is dead and it's infested with these bark beetles. That's what killed my tree." Most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, all these other things were happening way before, and the tree just trees are pretty amazing. They'll keep their leaves, they'll keep pushing out, flowers and fruit and things, even though they're under stress. And it's only until they reach that center of the spiral that they become susceptible to those bark beetles or fungi. And that's kind of like the final nail in the coffin. So oftentimes, all these things exist already. Like trees are already trying to, fend themselves from all these threats, and they're able to because they have whatever natural resistance, or they have um, systems in place to protect them, right, from these things. But it's only when they succumb to these different levels of the decline spiral that they become susceptible, and they're no longer resilient to these other things. um, you can often associate it with, so when COVID hit, it was, obviously a very terrible time. But to me, it was like, wow, this is just like forced health, right? Because what was the message? It was like, if you're immune compromised, if you have pre-existing respiratory issues, right, you're going to be very susceptible to COVID, right? But if you were like a healthy individual, then, you might get a little sick, but you'd be okay. So it's all kind of similar, right? So if their immune system is down or declining, then they become less able to respond or be resilient to these other stressors that are just waiting, right, for that tree's immune system to be down. So often the contributing factors get blamed for the reason of mortality, but it is usually all those other things that happened before that made the trees susceptible at that time. But it's so hard to identify because it could have been a drought that happened 3 years ago,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That happened. It lowered the tree's susceptibility, and then and then whatever, and then they had hemlock woolly adelgid, right? So it's a very tricky business, and very difficult to pinpoint. This is the thing. So what we try to do is we try to manage or control the one stressor that we can. So we can't control things like drought, or late season frost, or things like that, warm winters. We can't control those things, but what can we control? Sometimes we can control applying a pesticide to protect a certain population of trees that are high value or important to save. And so you kind of take away that stress so that they can get past that drought or the frost or the warm winter or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like, we can only control one part of that that decline spiral.
Hmm. Well, it also shows how important like early detection and monitoring comes when it comes to invasive species and these diseases. Once you kind of are able to see it in the early stages, you're like, all right, here's a way of treatment, so we don't start to spiral and get down where big swaths of trees are getting wiped out.
Right. Yeah, definitely early detection is certainly very helpful. But earlier I talked about things we don't know. So things like emerald ash borer, like that was not on anybody's radar. And when it was detected in Michigan, I think they estimated it was there for 10 years before
Mm.
someone even said like, hey, there's a problem. So imagine like what happened in that 10 years of time. Um, and if it could have been identified like very early on, it could have very well been, have not spread as far as it had. So it is really critical. Yeah, if we can kind of nip things in the bud, but it's also really hard because trees do a really good job of masking stress for a long time. And the comparison I give is like, if you've ever cut a Christmas tree in the winter, you bring it in your house and it stays green for a long time, right?
Hmm.
And functionally it's dead, but it doesn't appear that way, right? Its leaves are still green. Um, and so trees in the forests that could be under stress or functionally dead, sometimes they don't show those signs until later on. So it gets really tricky. And things like emerald ash borer, you know because that's the way that it affects trees, it's feeding on the cambium layer of the tree, which is like the living tissue that transports water and nutrients under the bark. It's a numbers game. So if you have like one emerald ash borer, that's not going to kill a tree, right? If you have 100 emerald ash borer, the tree might be like a little stressed out. So you actually have to also wait till those populations get so high and that tree has had so much damage, which could take, like 3 or 4 years or whatever it might be. So even seeing the impacts could take a long time, depending on how that insect or pathogen functions and operates. So early detection, yeah, is critical. We do a lot of monitoring and trapping, but it does get difficult if you don't like catch the thing, or you can't see it. The tree's not saying like, "Hey, I'm stressed out or I'm dying."
Yeah. Yeah.
They're really good at
There's no tree therapists out there that are just like, and how are we feeling today? Yeah.
right. Right. Oftentimes they look healthier because they're like, oh, something's going on. So they'll push out more leaves, or they'll push out more seeds or fruits. They do it as a survival mechanism. So sometimes people are like, my tree looked great. And then all of a sudden it died because it was kind of that last ditch effort to survive, and then it'll die. Yeah. So it's very tricky.
Man, tree, stop giving us mixed signals. Just be honest with us for once in your life. Just tell us what's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you mentioned it kind of earlier about like beech leaf disease and beech bark disease. Diseases like those are less visible than like insects that you can kind of see on bark. Why are they so concerning?
I think if you mean like the actual like fungus or disease, it's not like an insect where you can necessarily go up and see it easily, but there are other things that you can tell. So which with beech leaf disease, there's the banding of the leaves, but maybe more noticeable will be when the leaves start to turn brown, or the crown starts to thin out. The leaves do get, after a few years of infection, they do start to look different. Like they'll get more of a like a wrinkly, I guess, appearance, and the banding becomes a little more visible. Whereas like earlier on, it might just be like a single band on a leaf,
Hmm.
but as it progresses and there's more and more nematodes, then it affects more of the leaves, or leaves don't even emerge. With beech bark disease, you can actually see the fungus. It's like they're small, but they come in like patches, and they're red. And so you can actually see them. They look like, I don't know, maybe like welts all up and down the bark. So
Hmm.
with that, you'll notice the bark. So beech bark is a very smooth and gray, looking bark. It's the tree that most people engrave their initials in, or things like that. But when a beech tree has beech bark disease, that bark gets really funky looking, because it's trying to respond to the fungus, attacking the bark. So it gets very like, you know, I don't know, rigid looking, and it has these, strange appearance. It's not that smooth gray bark. So there, you may not actually see the thing, right? But you can certainly tell, like, it looks different than a healthy looking beech tree. So maybe that's what, if folks notice that, maybe that's a sign to like, hey, maybe look closer, can you see other things going on?
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. Join the Keystone Trails Association for the Appalachian Trail History Hike Series. Hikes take place on June 6th and 27th in collaboration with America 250 PA, Cumberland County. Learn more at kta-hike.org. It's better outside, especially with a Purple Lizard map in your pack. Their award-winning cartography helps you see the big picture and explore some of the best outdoor destinations in Pennsylvania. Each map reveals trails, forests, and small towns waiting to be discovered, helping you plan, wander, and reconnect with the world around you. Discover the Pennsylvania Outdoor Recreation Map and the full collection at purplelizard.com, where outstanding maps lead to outstanding adventures. Hey fellow explorers, this is a message from the Pennsylvania Parks and Forests Foundation. You know those incredible state parks and forests Christian talks about in every episode? We're the ones helping make sure they stay incredible. From maintaining the trails you hike, to engaging volunteer groups who make your experience better, to supporting conservation projects that protect Pennsylvania's natural treasures while keeping these places accessible. We're behind the scenes making it happen. Whether you're planning your next waterfall hike or just dreaming about your favorite overlook, know that PPFF is working to preserve these special places for future generations of explorers. Learn more at paparksandforests.org. Looking to add some Pennsylvania charm to your space? Sister Sunflowers has you covered. Their unique stickers highlight the small local spots that make your community shine, from quirky caves to hidden gems. Perfect for your laptop, water bottle, or anywhere that needs a little hometown love. They got stickers, magnets, prints, and even a hand-drawn poster to keep track of all the Pennsylvania state parks and forests you've explored. Use code HELLBENDER15 for 15% off your first order. Support local, inspire adventure, and decorate with meaning, only at Sister Sunflowers. Looking for a spring getaway that's both peaceful and pulse-pounding? Discover Clarion County in western Pennsylvania. This May 8th and 9th, catch the roar of the Appalachian Mountain Stoll competition as pilots from across the nation tackle gravity-defying takeoffs and landings. Once the excitement winds down, find ear quiet in the Forest Cathedral of Cook Forest State Park. Wander through ancient pines, paddle the winding Clarion River, or lose yourself on miles of scenic trails. From high-end Airbnbs and cabins to cozy family campgrounds, your perfect stay is closer than you think. Plan your spring escape at discoverclarioncounty.com. Clarion County, your trailhead to happiness. Feeling stuck under winter layers and winter deadlines? Trade stale meetings for open air. Step out of the office and into the Laurel Highlands for a spring hiking weekend hosted by the Keystone Trails Association from May 1st to 3rd. Plan for 3 exhilarating days filled with more than 40 activities. Enjoy guided hikes and learn about birding, Frank Lloyd Wright's falling water, first aid, fly casting, and more. There's even a discounted room rate at the historic Summit Inn. Register today at kta-hike.org. All right, back to the show. What role does climate change play in worsening existing threats to trees in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to the decline spiral. So when trees are normally acclimated to certain climatic conditions, and then changing that is kind of an added stress, right? And if they're trying to deal with that, and then they have these other stressors, like these other inciting factors, sometimes they're not as resilient. So we talked a little bit about that. But on the so first is like how a tree is able to respond to those other stressors when they have that additional stress of climate change, whether that's like the drought, sometimes it's excess water, right? Too much water. But on the other side, when you think about pests and diseases, and even some of them might be native, climate change, I think, affects also how native insects and diseases respond. So if you think about like a lot of native pests or maybe diseases are impacted by cold winter temperatures, right? So only certain number of generations survive in a year. Usually it's one, but it could be more than one. So let's just say an insect has one generation per year. In the winter, they go dormant or the adults die off. And then in the spring, they emerge and kind of the cycle starts over again. Well, let's just think about if you have a longer growing season, and now this insect that historically had one generation now has two. So you've essentially doubled the amount of that insect feeding on whatever it might feed on, right? And so having that extra generation just puts more of whatever it is, more of that population out there, putting the pressure on plants or trees that normally that tree could handle because maybe it was, a minimal level of feeding, right? So it could kind of recover from it. But now you're doubling that or tripling that, that's another way that the changing in the climate affects trees. And if you think about fungi, the one driving factor of fungi is moisture oftentimes. So if you think about if we have a really wet summer or season, and that fungus can kind of explode during a time when normally it wouldn't, that's again adding another stress to the tree that normally, it wouldn't. Maybe it was, historically a spring fungi and, kind of fizzled out into the summer as it got drier. So just things like that, the changing of the climate and how these natural systems, it affects how these natural systems even function, So now trees not only have to deal with non-native pests and threats, now they're also having to deal with, native organisms maybe acting differently or behave, just because of how the climates are changing.
On a side note, I feel like I was brought up saying the word fungi, and then somebody
Oh,
along the way changed it and said fungi. Is it just I was never good at science, and that's why I've always said it wrong, or is that just a thing that changed in the past 20 years or so?
I don't know. Maybe you say fungi because you're a fun guy.
Well, first of all, I'm going to clip that and use that. That's awesome. Thank you. I just feel like every time I hear somebody say fungi, it's kind of like the GIF and GIF where somebody says, it, I'm like, I don't know. I just think you're wrong. But you are obviously very right. But it just is so tough for me to say fungi. I just want to say
No,
fungi. I don't know what it is.
I think you can use either.
Okay. Well,
Tomato,
that.
tomato,
Oh,
right?
I love that. Yes. Which I've also never met anyone who says, I'm going to have a tomato sandwich. I'm still
No,
waiting
me
for one.
neither.
Yeah. Potato sandwich. Okay. Sorry. Get back, get back on
So
track. But you kept saying fungi, and I was like, oh man, I gotta figure this thing out.
I
Um,
think either way is fine.
what signs should like everyday hikers or like homeowners look for that might indicate a tree is in trouble? What are some of the things they might find?
It's all about observation, and that's kind of hard, I know, for some folks if they're not used to or, take notice, but it is observation because sometimes it's subtle. Like I said before, trees are really good at masking when they're starting to feel stressed. And so it's just tracking. So, like, for instance, maybe if it's a tree in your yard and you notice that, um, you know, every spring it puts out leaves, they're green, it looks pretty full and great, and then through the summer, it's looking good. But maybe the next year the leaves are a little smaller, or you have a few dead branches or something like that. And it could be very gradual, so it's just kind of being observant. And we rely on that heavily, so it's like kind of just going back and tracking, like, well, what did this look like last year or 3 years ago, kind of thing. And you kind of try to put it together. Like, is it something we should be worried about? Or is it something that it's recovering from? Obviously, if you see things like insect damage, which could be like holes in the bark or defoliation in the leaves, like feeding on the leaves, any kind of leaf discoloration that's happening early in the summer when the leaves should not be changing, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
if your trees are changing leaf color in the late spring, that might be something to worry about. um, Trees also put out sprouts, like I mentioned before, when they're stressed. So these could be like stump sprouts or water sprouts from the base of the tree. So if you see that, sometimes that's a sign of stress. Or even sprouts coming out from the trunk of the tree. So you know I don't know how else to explain it, but it's like not where the branches are normally growing. So if you have the trunk of the tree that has no branches and then the branches are at the top, and you start noticing new branches coming out of the trunk, those are called epicormic sprouts, and that could be a sign too of stress. So even though like everything else might be good, like tree still has leaves on it, it's still flowering, but it's got all these additional branches coming out of the trunk or at the base. Those could be signs of stress too. So it's really just being observant and seeing like, hey, this didn't happen last year or in the last 5 years, but now it is, just to take a closer look.
I'm wondering too, like one of the things that makes me maybe the most angry when I'm hiking is seeing people carve their initials in trees. It makes me like intensely angry. What does that do to a tree when you mark it like that?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends. I think for the most part, um, if it's just like one, probably not too much. So, but if it becomes like a lot, and maybe someone is using the same pocket knife from tree to tree to tree, maybe they could be transmitting something from one tree to another. Some trees are susceptible to like open wounds. So if you create that open wound, you might be creating an entry point for a pathogen, things like that. But I think like for the most part, if it's like one or very minimal, probably not much, because that tree can, if it's healthy enough, it can probably, kind of grow over that wound and recover. But like, I mentioned earlier, beech trees, because they're smooth bark, people carve their names in it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, beech bark disease is a complex between an insect and a fungus, and it needs the insect to create the wound for the fungus to enter. So the
Okay.
fungus, the beech bark disease fungus, which is what causes the damage, can't in of itself enter the tree. So it needs a wound. So if people are carving their names and maybe there's low beech scale, which is the insect that creates the wound, but now you're carving your name, then that you're creating those entry points. And I have seen the fungus fruiting bodies like along the edges of carvings because
Oh,
that's like
wow.
the entry point of where
Hmm.
the fungus entered. Yeah, so yes, it could make things a little easier for things to establish and enter the tree that normally wouldn't.
Don't carve on trees, people. Anyone
Yeah,
who's listening to this podcast, if you're carving on a tree, find another friggin' podcast. That's crazy if you were to do that. I don't like you. If you're the sort of listener that does that, I don't like you. I don't support your efforts. Um, what role do native species diversity and forest complexity play in like resisting future threats?
well, I think, diversity is probably a good thing to have because we can't always predict what's coming in, but a lot of these non-native invasive pests or diseases, they do seem to be pretty either species or genera specific. So very rarely is something introduced and it's like, oh, it's gonna like all of our hardwood trees are susceptible to it. Like it's kind of rare. So the more diversity you have, I would say the more resilient to some extent. Because then, I mean, if you think about like emerald ash borer, fortunately, I guess there's not really, large, widespread stands of ash across the Commonwealth, right? It's kind of either mixed in with other species or along, field edges, like that type of thing. So it's not really impacting the entire area, and having it mixed with other species is helpful because when those ash died off, then other tree and shrub species kind of filled in, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's good to have diversity. As far as the native, I think that's harder to answer because a lot of times it is our native species that are the most susceptible to these introduced um, pests. So it's hard. I mean, I think the bottom line is by doing your best to have a resilient forest, right? Making sure that of the things we can control. So, if you're responsible for managing a forest, things you can control are things like density, right? So, making sure that the trees have enough space and sunlight and nutrients, right? Maybe thinning it out so that, like, that's one less thing that they need to stress out about, is really helpful. In fact, we see that with some invasive pests, it can be density dependent. So if you have stands that are at a certain level of density, then the pest has a much harder time establishing and causing that widespread mortality. Just because maybe number one, the trees are a little more resilient, but number two, having the space, having that wider spacing between the trees so that pests or, can't travel from host to host as easily. So I'll use COVID as another example, right? Remember social distancing, like that's how we kept it in check. Trees, some pests are the same way. If you have some of that distance, it can reduce the risk of that pest spreading from tree to tree more easily. So it kind of makes sense, right? Like
Yeah.
if you think about
How can the average Pennsylvania help protect trees, whether in their backyard or in public lands? You talked about kind of density and spacing. What else can they possibly do?
um well, yes, it's actively managing. Like if they have a forest, it is actively managing their forest to kind of make sure that their forest and trees are as resilient and healthy as possible. Making sure that if they have invasives in the understory, right? We talked about regeneration in the beginning, like what's coming up next. So you want to have this healthy system in place that when that overstory tree, they're going to die at some point, whether it's old age or a windstorm or something like that. You kind of want to make sure that that next generation is has the ability to kind of establish. But I think the other thing is, I mentioned earlier being observant. So if people do see strange things happening or an insect or something that they've never seen before, it is kind of that early detection. So we do rely heavily on people to let us know if they see something, because we only have so many folks on our staff who are out there looking. But if we have everybody kind of out there looking and reporting, strange or new things, then we can certainly address those problems sooner than later.
Does somebody, if they find something wrong with their trees, do they reach out to an arborist? Do they reach out to a state department? What's the best way to kind of go from that forward if they see something going on?
Well, I guess it depends. If it's something that's known, like if they say I have an ash tree and I know emerald ash borer is here and I want to save it. Well, in that sense, they should contact, yeah, like a licensed arborist who can help them treat their tree. We won't necessarily do that, but we could provide them with information of what options they might have, to address emerald ash borer. But if it's something different or new, or that they have no idea what it might be, then yeah, I would say that they should contact us and let us know, and we can kind of either they can send us pictures or we can go out and take a look. We also keep an eye out for things that are occurring in adjacent states or in, kind of like a heads up type of thing. It's not here yet, but we want to keep our eyes peeled. So if they hear of those types of things, then they should probably contact us if they think that they have that.
Looking ahead 50 or 100 years, what do you hope Pennsylvania's forest will look like, and what needs to happen now to get there?
Well, I would say everything we do today is for the forests in 50 or 100 years. Our actions today aren't for today, they're for the future, because trees and forests do live so long. So, I hope that the forests are healthy with native species and, you know, you might have picked up that I'm a huge proponent of regeneration, so that they're regenerating and that next cohort is kind of always ready to go. Um, Obviously, I don't know what it's going to look like because I'm sure our forests today look a lot different than they did 100 years ago. And maybe at that time, those foresters weren't sure what it would look like today. But I think keeping forests as forests and having our native species, you know, being the dominant forest types and plant species would be critical so that we can ensure that kind of like how the role they play in that whole food web and forest ecosystem, we want to try to maintain um, that level. So yeah, hopefully it's still forested and the trees are healthy enough to regenerate and there's not a blanket of invasives so that the seedlings can germinate.
Yeah, if you hike overseas, make sure you wash everything before you get back into this friggin' country. Don't bring anything over from Europe or Asia. We don't need anything else.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true.
Rosa, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. This is awesome.
I want to thank my guest, Rosa Yu, for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstohellbenders.com, or you can click support this show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.